is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a growing number of school districts, education reporters are covering incidents of racism, antisemitism, and hate committed by students. But what happens when the spotlight moves on to the next story of the day? That's the question today's guest set out to answer. She's Dahlia Bazazz, part of the education team at the Seattle Times. Dahlia, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Let's start at the top. Why was now the time for you to take a look at how school communities were handling the aftermath of these incidents at schools in your area?
There was no particular reason for why the story ran at the time it did, but for me, it was important to give some of these incidents some time to breathe so that when I went back to ask about what had happened, people would perhaps have more fully formed ideas of what had happened preceding and the school's efforts to recover or respond in the aftermath.
Give us an idea of what some of those incidents were.
There were a few. One that we just came up on the 1-year anniversary of was a racist student newspaper cover that ran at Roosevelt High School in Seattle. And it had this image of a Black man dressed in casual garb exchanging a package with the label Cure with a white man in a business suit. And the criticism of the illustration reflected that this associated Black people with drug use, which is a pretty common stereotype. And the headline on the story was "The Struggles of a Life with Addiction." And that created a lot of uproar here in Seattle. There was another incident out in Mercer Island, which is a pretty wealthy community east of Seattle. And 2 students had posed doing the Nazi salute. And that was last April. And then in another eastern school district in King County, which is Seattle's county, in Issaquah, there were 2 incidents that happened. One was earlier last year where a student had made this prom or dance proposal for another student that said, if I were Black, I'd be picking cotton, but I'm not, so I pick you. And then a couple of weeks before the year ended in 2019, there was another incident where a video on Snapchat circulated at a different high school in Issaquah. And it was of a white student using the N-word and saying that Black people should be hung and spelling out KKK in a cheer.
Obviously, these are all very disturbing examples, and the schools were upset, the communities were upset. Give us an idea about these school communities. How diverse are these campuses that you're talking about?
They are not diverse at all. Most of them, or all of them actually, are majority white schools. They're in wealthier areas. And in these environments, and this wasn't explicitly mentioned in the story, but it was definitely a common thread, when students of color speak out, or Jewish students, or any student that really isn't in the dominant or majority group on campus, it's like doubly uncomfortable because the rest of the school maybe isn't paying attention to that incident. And so when this crops up, it's just a big surprise for everybody that's maybe not enduring this on a daily basis. So it adds another layer to a lot of the discrimination that these students face on a daily basis. It's just that, they can't necessarily turn to their peers or see another person like them in the school very often to talk about these incidents through who would understand.
Do you have a sense that there's been an increase in these incidents in the Seattle area, or is there just more awareness of it, either because students are reporting the problems to officials, or maybe because there's been more news coverage?
I think this is a complicated question. One of the pieces of research that I cited was from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it said that less than 5% of hate incidents end up in the news. And yet I did get this question from editors and from other people, is there an increase in hate-based incidents at schools? The FBI's numbers say that there have been in recent years, but I think that this is a complicated question. I decided in the end to not tackle this in my story because we know that racism, without a doubt, is a daily reality in American schools. And a lot of the school climate people that I spoke to for this story also didn't want to give a definitive answer. They said, we can make a guess, but it's not a sure thing. I think that the white supremacy and anti-immigrant sentiment that people have attributed to Trump's campaign and time in office has always been there. It's just that people perceive a more direct line coming from high-ranking politicians into the type of vocabulary used around racist events that happen in schools. So maybe instead of "go back to your country," racist bullying looks more like kids shouting "build a wall." We know that how often media cover something can play a critical role in shaping how we think about an issue.
Beyond creating a school climate that's unwelcoming, and query would make it very hard for kids to learn. You've reported that these incidents can actually have a longer term impact on individual students' health. What did you find out?
We do see a lot of research that racism and daily discrimination releases stress chemicals through somebody's body. And even if it's not necessarily directly experienced by a student, it can be experienced vicariously through a parent who has gone through these incidents, who is carrying generational trauma. And it can also mess with a student's ability to feel motivated to stay in class. So there's that research, and then there's the anecdotal information that I just received from students. There's a student quoted in the story at the school where the video circulated of a cheerleader using the N-word, talking to a student of the school who shares a class with the student who is in the video. And he says, "I just want to get up and leave the class out of frustration." So there's a very real impact, but I just want to stress again that there's also a bystander effect that some researchers have found to also be a big deal. So it's not necessarily just the students who are targeted, it's also witnessing these types of events.
There's often a familiar pattern when something like this happens. There'll be a response or an official statement put out by the district or the school board. Then there may be some kind of a school assembly or an expert brought in to try to offer some kind of corrective programming for the students and staff. Is that the pattern that you saw in these Seattle schools?
That definitely reflects what happened, and what I found in the stories definitely reflects that pattern. And that's what I wanted to sort of reach beyond in the story, because I think that it take more than just the assembly or the immediate aftermath, according to what the experts had told me, to really make sure that the lessons that arise from having like a very public display of a student's prejudice or bigotry have to be constantly reinforced. So there was one area where a school went above what others had done after a very public display. So in Mercer Island, one school went through a partnership with the Anti-Defamation League. And Mercer Island was the school where the students had posed with the Nazi salute. And so that involved training students and staff members on how to address racism or intolerance in a conversation, just very practical lessons on how to mention it specifically, or how to tell somebody that what they had just said was racist and then offer an alternative. And so the idea behind that is that students then go and create events and spread those lessons to their peers. That was the different and more involved examples. And in other schools, there were more sort of training for teachers. There were some changes to curriculum. But the Mercer Island School District was the only one that really had this heavy level of involvement with an outside organization.
We're talking with Dahlia Bazazz of the education team at the Seattle Times about her reporting on how schools deal with the aftermath of hate-related incidents involving their students. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you for taking the time to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Dahlia, how did you set out to gather the data and to figure out what school systems had done in the aftermath of these instances? Did you survey schools? Did you have a set of questions and asked everyone the same thing? I'd like to hear how you did it.
So this is a difficult story to write because I am very focused on data, and data about how healthy an environment is in a particular school is hard to come by, or at least reliable data. Surveys that are given to parents and to students are typically filled out by a certain privileged or very vocal segment of the school community. So it's often not representative of how everyone feels. So for each school or every incident, I had the goal of interviewing the principal, a few students, a few parents, and a couple of teachers. And I also wanted to get a sense of the district's policy around handling incidents of hate, if they had one. And I was able in the end to get all of these stakeholders to talk to me for every incident except for the principals. 2 of the 4 that I requested comment from declined to talk to me. The way I got in touch with the folks that I wanted to talk to was usually through either the district spokespeople, if they would offer them, through civil rights advocates who come into these situations and talk to the parents and students, who were able to connect me with a few folks through contacts my colleagues and I had already made at those schools when we originally covered the incidents. And I also reached out to PTAs and teachers union groups.
Dahlia, there were a lot of moving parts to this story. How did you keep track of these dozens of interviews and also the data?
It was a reporting professor back in college that I had who recommended to keep a source list. So I have this just Google Sheets document that has the name and the title and the organization and the gender, race, age, and then sort of a status column in the spreadsheet where I could keep track of whether or not they had answered my email or whether we had an interview scheduled or whether they just completely ghosted me. So I was able to keep track of more than 40 people that I reached out to and make sure that I was contacting a student's parents and just leaving notes there to make sure I hadn't missed anything.
Please tell me you put the ghost icon in the ghost column.
I didn't know. That was a missed opportunity.
Dahlia. All right. I'm just a tiny bit disappointed. But on a more serious note, I mean, clearly there's a lot of folks to keep track of. And as much as we talk about the administrative response here, a lot of this is about trying to help students reframe the way they think about some of these things and the language that they choose to use and behaviors that they choose to either accept or to emulate. How did you find students for this story?
In Seattle, we have a very activated group of students, particularly around issues of racism. This is just what the region is known for. We just have a very activist culture. And so there are a few groups, student advocacy groups, particularly the NAACP's Youth Coalition. And I text with some of the students in that group, and I asked them for some students who attended the schools that I worked at, and for some contacts of teachers they thought would be willing to talk. And I also keep a separate sort of source list just generally for my beat. And I fill that with students I've talked to at protests, whether it's March for Our Lives or the climate strike. And I make sure to log what school they go to. So I was just able to go back to that list and look students up there. And then I also looked at social media. So I would look in Facebook search bar for Issaquah High School racism or something like that. And then it popped up. One of the students that I found had popped up and was writing about that. And so I messaged her and we ended up talking. And I would say the advice that I have for speaking, corresponding with students, texting has been the number one way that I do it. I don't call first and leave a voice message. I send a text at first, and they are pretty responsive in my experience.
I completely agree that texting is definitely the way to go. And if for no other reason, you've got it right in front of you and it's a nice written record of the exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think contrary to what a lot of people will say about the Gen Z segment of the population not being responsive or being flaky, I've actually found the opposite to be true. They're often the ones to answer my calls or my requests for interviews a lot faster.
Dahlia, you were a student in Oregon schools not so long ago. Has that helped you to sort of dig into the beat here?
Um, I think in some ways, yes, some ways, no. I mean, when I was in school in Oregon, Oregon doesn't have as much of an activist culture. There isn't as much, I guess, awareness of racism, or there wasn't when I was there. And so it was even less that these types of incidents got news coverage. But I think knowing what it's like to be in a school as a student of color, to not have a huge community in that school of people who grew up with the same background or the same race as you, that resonated with me a lot. And I think I could ask better questions because of that and was able to make students feel more comfortable that way.
Well, we talk about diversity being a value in a newsroom, especially on the education beat, and that is something that EWA is trying to help foster. So you do see your ethnic and cultural perspective as shaping or influencing your work?
I do, yeah. And I think there's a very particular experience around being a student of color, remembering what that's like and seeing how that really impacts a lot of your experience in school and the sense of belonging that you are theoretically supposed to get in school. If you don't have that, or if you don't feel that from the adults who work in your school, it can be a struggle. But I will say that being a person of color is not a substitute for learning about other forms of discrimination or other experiences that I was not touched by. So, I would caution people thinking that just because I grew up in a Middle Eastern household, my parents are Iraqi, I don't understand anti-Black sentiment, or I can't apply that to situations of anti-Black sentiment. I have to go and do the work and understand how that affects students. And so I just want to put that out there as well.
There have been some recent stories in the national media, some drawn from that Southern Poverty Law Center research that we were talking about. Francisco Verarota, he's a longtime education reporter, former EWA board member. He's now with IRE. He co-authored Education Week's Documenting Hate Project, a partnership with ProPublica a couple of years ago. In a recent Twitter thread, he pointed out that subsequent reporting on this issue is sometimes through a limited lens. In other words, as education reporters and just general reporters, it's natural to sort of focus on what happened today and to not necessarily frame that racist incident as sort of illuminating an experience that marginalized students have endured for a long time. Was that something you had in mind when you were thinking about this reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that racism has touched almost every single story that I've written on the education beat. And so I think this element of surprise that the media can sometimes bring or showcase from people who are responding can often be insulting to the parents, to the students who have been witnessing this for years. As I said before, racism is an everyday reality in American public schools. And so treating these incidents like they're somehow not reflective of a deeper cultural problem that we have in schools is ignoring the larger context.
So, Dahlia, these are sensitive topics and difficult ones for people to talk about. It can also be challenging for reporters to write about. What are some areas where you would recommend people exercise particular caution?
I would be careful to make sure that you're not focusing too much on the trauma that students have endured and giving equal and more weight to how adults are responding to these issues. I think that in these cases, especially where the school is majority white, it can be very uncomfortable for students to speak out and to have them speaking out in the press about it. And then the next day, them going to school and perhaps becoming a target of discrimination further or being singled out even more than they already are. So I'd be careful of that. And I would also give people a reminder to recognize that there are different types of discrimination and that anti-Black sentiment is different from anti-immigrant sentiment or antisemitism. And you should also be careful about posing anything close to a silver bullet for trying to address intolerance or prejudice in schools.
What are some story ideas for local reporters who may want to try to get deeper into this and to avoid that kind of one-off approach of X incident happened today at Y school?
I would say that one of the things that I would like to look into after doing this story is this concept of accountability. I heard consistently from parents and students that it's very hard to report these types of incidents that don't get a lot of notoriety and get accountability or some sort of answer. So I would look at the policies that your district or that your state has about handling hate incidents in schools or hate incidents in general, and see if there's a civil rights division within your state that handles this and what the laws are around that. I would also look into how much training principals and teachers are given for handling bigotry or racism among students. Do they have experience in trying to diffuse these situations? Are they able to start conversations in their classes about race? That's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of educators to handle, even in this day and age. And I would look into the avenues that parents and students have to report, and then also looking at the surrounding community and their reputation for racism and intolerance. Because as Maureen Costello, former executive director of Teaching Tolerance, just a division of the Southern Poverty Law Center, she said that schools are just reflections of communities. So looking into how that surrounding city or neighborhood and what they're like can often give you a lot of clues into why something is happening in a school.
Dahlia Bazazz is part of the education team at the Seattle Times. She is also, I am very proud to say, an alum of EWA's New to the Beat program. Dahlia, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks again for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.